Congratulations, you've reached the end of another course section. So as always, let's take a few moments to review everything we learned. So this section was focused on testing, and in order to test with React, we combined two libraries, Jest, which was our test runner, and React testing library, which was our component mounting library and our DOM querying library. So let's begin with a review of Jest, which is a popular open source test runner developed by Facebook. So within a Jest file, which is just a regular JavaScript file with a .test.js or a .spec.js extension, we have access to a whole bunch of global functions. We begin with the describe function, which allows us to provide a header, or another way I can describe it is a chapter title for a related collection of tests. So describe is completely optional, but it allows us to organize our tests or provide additional context on what we're testing. So we pass describe a descriptive string and then an arrow function in which we nest the tests. Remember, you can nest multiple describe functions within higher level describe functions, and you can also have multiple describe functions at the top level of a test file. It is purely for the sake of organization. Then we moved on to the it function, and that is what creates an actual test. To it, we pass a description of what will be tested. That is the first argument, and that is a string. And then we pass an arrow function in which we actually write our test, our actual assertions. Remember that the goal of it and the reason it is named that way is so that your description reads like a sentence. It does this. It renders like so. It presents the user this option. So it's supposed to read almost like human language and as a description of what you are testing. Remember to keep your test descriptions precise and also focus on the user value. Don't get bogged down in the implementation or the details of the technical code. Describe what is the responsibility of the given unit, whether it be a function or a class or a component. All right. Also, as a quick reminder, there is a test function within Jest, and that is an alias for it. So the two are the same function under the hood. So if you open up a Jest file in some code base and you see a bunch of tests or the test function invocations, it's the exact same thing under the hood. All right, so within the function that we pass to it, we use the expect function also from Jest, and we pass it an evaluation. And this could be whatever code we want to run. It can be a class instantiation or a method invocation or a function execution. So Jest is going to execute that logic and give us back an object of matchers. A matcher is just an assertion. It allows us to perform a different kind of validation. So two matchers that we explored in this section were to be, which checks for strict equality and should be used for things like strings, numbers, and booleans, and also to equal, which allows us to compare the equality of things like arrays. And there's many more dozen methods on that expect object that you can use to query and test for much more complex things. As I mentioned, you can test, for example, whether an array contains a value at some point inside it. So you don't have to memorize all of these matchers. It's just important to explore the Jest documentation from time to time to learn all of the available options that you have, because there's a lot of really powerful ways that you can write your assertions and validate different aspects of your code. So Jest was our test runner, but in order to make it work with React, we needed to add an additional library to mount our actual component, to render it, and we did that with the React testing library from Kent C. Dodds. That library provides a top-level render function that renders your component to a virtual DOM. So it actually translates your JSX into the equivalent HTML, and it puts those DOM nodes into this virtual DOM. So there's no real browser in play here, but we are sort of in a simulated environment where we have very similar functionality to a browser. We can build up this tree structure of your DOM nodes and then query that resulting HTML and interact with it in the exact same way we would as a user in the browser. So we saw that we had that screen object also available as a top-level import, and that represents the actual user screen/interface. And it also includes dozens of different query methods that we can utilize to query the DOM in different ways. So we can search for elements by their role, or by their placeholder text, or by the text they hold, etc. There's a lot of different ways, and as we also saw, there are preferred ways, and the usual recommendation is to query by role, because that is the most accessible way to query. We also saw the helpful debug method on the screen object, and that prints the current HTML. So as you interact with your component, you can observe it change over time. Okay, speaking of the getByRole method, that is on the screen object, and it searches for a single element in your markup with a given ARIA role. Keep in mind the entire get family of methods, because there are different methods beginning with the word get. The commonality between them is that they will raise an error if the element cannot be found. Also keep in mind they will raise an error if multiple elements are found that satisfy that criteria. So React Testing Library wants you to be as specific and precise as possible so it can locate the single element that you are looking for. Keep in mind the getByRole method, as well as the entire get family of methods, is synchronous. So it's going to execute right then and there. So if your markup is not in the DOM yet, it's not going to find it and your test will fail. And the reason I bring that up is sometimes you may want your component to wait, for example, to receive an API response and then render the result of that on the screen. We haven't gotten there yet, but that is a common use case, and it may thus take some time for the DOM to be updated after the initial component render. And that may cause problems with getByRole because it does the query or the DOM node search right then and there in the code when it is being called. So just keep that in mind, because there are other methods in the React Testing Library that allow you to have an asynchronous method where it's going to wait a little bit, like a second, before it queries the DOM, just to give it a moment to update and allow those new DOM nodes to appear. So to the getByRole method, we can also provide a configuration object as the second argument, and that allows you to be more specific or precise in the element you're searching for. So if, for example, you run into an issue where it is finding more than one element that satisfies the criteria you're searching for, you'll need to provide that configuration object to give it additional details that it can use to filter that down to just one element. So how do we interact with those actual DOM nodes that React Testing Library creates for us? For that, we import the user event object from the testing library user event library. It's the same group of folks who develop React Testing Library. It's just a separate library in that organization. And that user event object, of course, has a whole bunch of methods that simulate user interactions, such as user clicks or the user typing, basically anything that you can do in a visual browser. So typically you'll call user event.click or user event.type, and you'll give it a reference to a DOM node that you will query for using your React Testing Library screen methods like getByRole. But it doesn't matter how you query, as long as you're able to find some element, then you are able to pass it into that user event method. And then as long as it's able to act upon it, it will, right? So you have to know obviously what you're dealing with. If you're working with a text field, you have to type into it rather than click into it, but that's all kind of obvious common sense. And a lot of the API for this object is kind of intuitive. It's going to be given method names that completely correspond to real world user actions, like click, like type, like double click, etc. Okay, and finally, some extra bits, some additional details that I might have missed. So we know there are additional ways to query for elements such as getByLabel or getByPlaceholder text. Sometimes you're not going to be able to query by role, and that's fine. And the Testing Playground Chrome extension can help you discover the ideal query method, or maybe even some query method if you're struggling to come up with one. And as a reminder, once you install that extension, you can open up your developer tools, click on that really nice frog icon, then use the selector there to select some element on your page, and it will give you the recommended query method, and you can just copy and paste that code into your editor. And of course, the more you practice with that, the more you'll commit these methods to memory. And over time, it just becomes second nature, and you know exactly how to query for a specific thing in your UI. Keep in mind, if you are struggling because your query is finding too many elements that satisfy a search query, it might be because your component is becoming too big, and that might be your indicator that you should break it up into smaller components. Another detail I forgot to mention, of course, is with React Testing Library, your components will be completely mounted. So that means if you're testing component A and it renders components B and C, and those render their own child components, React Testing Library will render the complete component tree, the complete hierarchy of DOM nodes. And that can sometimes be problematic because there may be an issue in those smaller child components that may cascade up into the component you're testing, but it may not be directly then and there in the code. That is both one of the criticisms of React Testing Library and also one of its benefits. The criticism, of course, is that the code may not even be up to you, right? Maybe you're using a component from another library and something is built wrong there, and that is causing your component to break. That is kind of further away from a unit test that isolates your component that you wrote and tests it in isolation. So that is a disadvantage. But it's also an advantage because it's working the exact same way it would for the user in the browser. So if something's not going to work in the browser for the user, you do want your tests to catch that so you can see if there's an alternative solution. So when you get closer to how the user experiences, you get a lot of benefits because there's actually value to these tests. They're testing the real world, but obviously they also increase in complexity. So as always, it's a matter of trade-offs. There were other libraries in the React testing ecosystem, such as Enzyme, that were a lot more unit focused. They could isolate a component, they can replace all of its children, they can allow you to interact with state and modify it on the fly. But again, that is a different testing methodology. I'm not going to say it's always worse or always better. It's a different perspective on how you test. The React testing library's perspective is make it as close as possible to the real user experience in the browser, because that is what your business cares about, testing that things are functional and not breaking for the user who is paying you money, right? Finally, we saw one more matcher, which is to be in the document, and that simply asserts that the given node or element that you query for with React Testing Library exists in the DOM. And that is a very common assertion you're going to be using, simply validating that the user sees what they expect to see after they perform some kind of interaction, such as typing or clicking. All right. And we also saw, I think actually getting a bit ahead of myself because I'm confusing my sections here. In the very next section, when we begin our refactor, we're actually going to see how our React Testing Library tests are going to hold up over time, even as we change the implementation of the component. And that will show you the true power of this library. So if all of this, or at least the benefit, isn't quite clear yet, just be patient for one more section because you'll see it in just a few lessons. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this section, and I will see you in the next lesson.